Welcome to Drowseworthy, where history's most dangerous moments become your most peaceful sleep. Tonight, we're exploring the Galveston hurricane of 1900, a disaster so catastrophic that you definitely wouldn't survive it. But don't worry, the calm narration and gentle rain sounds will help you drift off while learning about America's deadliest natural disaster that turned a thriving island paradise into a watery graveyard. If you love falling asleep to history's darkest chapters, subscribe for weekly bedtime disasters. Feel free to turn down the lights, maybe put a fan on for that gentle hum. Let's begin our journey back to September 8th, 1900, when Mother Nature decided to remind humanity just how small we really are. Why you wouldn't last a day as a Galveston resident during the hurricane. Picture this. You wake up on Saturday morning, September 8th, 1900, in your comfortable wooden home in Galveston, Texas. The Gulf breeze carries the usual salty Thames, but something feels different. The air seems heavier, more oppressive than usual. You step outside onto your porch, and the first thing you notice is how eerily calm everything appears. The palm trees barely sway, the seagulls seem restless, and there's an odd yellowish tint to the morning sky. You're living in what many consider the New York of the South, a bustling port city of 37,000 people, built on a barrier island barely 9 feet above sea level at its highest point. Your city is a marvel of late 19th century prosperity, with electric streetlights, telephone systems, and grand Victorian mansions lining Broadway. The Strand district bustles with cotton merchants, ship captains, and immigrants seeking their American dreams. But today, all of that civilization, all of that human progress, means absolutely nothing to the monster approaching from the Gulf of Mexico. By mid-morning, you notice the barometer in your neighbor's shop dropping at an alarming rate. If you knew how to read these signs, you'd realize that a massive low-pressure system is bearing down on your island home. But weather forecasting in 1900 is primitive at best. The US Weather Bureau has issued warnings about a tropical storm, but they've predicted it will make landfall near Florida, not Texas. You have no radar, no satellite imagery, no advanced warning systems. You're flying blind into history's deadliest hurricane. As the morning progresses, you feel the wind beginning to pick up. At first, it's just a stronger than usual breeze, the kind that makes your curtains dance and sends loose papers skittering across your yard. You might even welcome it, thinking it will provide relief from the oppressive heat that has been building for days. The temperature has been climbing steadily, reaching into the mid-90s with humidity that makes your clothes stick to your skin like a second layer of damp cotton. By noon, the wind has become more insistent. You step outside and have to hold onto your hat. The palm fronds are now thrashing back and forth with increasing violence, and you can hear the distinctive whistle of air being forced through the spaces between buildings. This is when you start to feel the first real stirrings of concern. The few horse-drawn carriages still on the streets are having difficulty maintaining their course as their horses become spooked by the increasingly chaotic environment. You notice that many of your neighbors have begun boarding up their windows. The sound of hammering fills the air as men scramble to secure their homes against what everyone now realizes is going to be a significant storm. But here's the thing that would doom you if you were actually there. Even the most prepared Galveston residents have no concept of what's actually coming their way. They're preparing for a bad storm, maybe some flooding, perhaps some roof damage. They have no idea they're about to face a wall of water 20 feet high, moving at the speed of a freight train. The afternoon brings the first real taste of the hurricane's power. You're forced to stay indoors as the wind now howls with a sound unlike anything you've ever experienced. It's not just loud, it's a continuous bone-deep roar that seems to penetrate every corner of your being. The wooden frame of your house begins to creak and groan like a living thing in pain. Every gust sends shudders through the structure, and you can feel the building actually swaying beneath your feet. This is when you'd first notice the water. It starts subtly, just a bit more moisture seeping under your front door than usual during a rainstorm. But this isn't rainwater. This is seawater, pushed inland by winds that have now reached sustained speeds of over 100 miles per hour. The Gulf of Mexico, normally held in check by beaches and sand dunes, is being forced across the island by a meteorological force more powerful than anything in recorded American history. By 3 p.m., you're standing in ankle-deep water inside your own home. The liquid is warm and salty, carrying with it debris that shouldn't exist in any civilized space. Seaweed, pieces of broken boats, fragments of other people's lives. You might try to save your belongings, frantically moving furniture to higher ground, but you're fighting a battle you cannot possibly win. The water is rising at a rate of about 1 foot per hour, and it shows no signs of slowing. If you're still alive by 4 p.m., you're now facing a choice that would likely seal your fate. Do you stay in your increasingly unstable house, or do you venture out into the storm to seek higher ground? Both options are essentially death sentences, but your human instinct for survival won't let you simply accept that fact. You choose to leave, wading out into what has become a surreal, aquatic nightmare. The moment you open your front door, you're hit by wind so powerful it nearly knocks you unconscious. The rain isn't falling down anymore. It's moving horizontally, each droplet hitting your skin like a tiny bullet. You can barely see 3 feet in front of you through the wall of water and debris flying through the air. Street signs, pieces of roofing, entire sections of fencing are all becoming deadly projectiles in the 145-mile-per-hour winds. The water outside is now waist-deep and moving with a current strong enough to knock a grown man off his feet. You're not just dealing with flooding anymore. You're dealing with a massive river where your neighborhood used to be. The current carries you along whether you want to go or not, and every step is a battle against forces that dwarf human strength. You're also sharing this water with things that definitely don't belong there: snakes, fire ants, and in some cases, alligators that have been swept in from the coastal marshes. As you struggle through the flooded streets, you begin to see the true scale of the destruction. Entire buildings are simply gone, leaving nothing but empty lots filled with churning water. Others have been picked up and moved, sitting at impossible angles or completely upside down. The famous Galveston Opera House, a symbol of the city's cultural sophistication, is partially submerged. Its elegant facade now just another obstacle in the urban river system that has replaced your familiar streets. By 5 p.m., you're fighting for your life in water that's now over your head. You're no longer walking, you're swimming, or rather, you're being carried along by currents that are reshaping the very geography of the island. The storm surge has reached its peak, and you're experiencing something that most human beings in 1900 had never even conceived of. A wall of ocean water moving across land at incredible speed, picking up everything in its path and turning it into a liquid battering ram. This is when you'd encounter one of the most horrifying aspects of the Galveston hurricane: the debris fields. As the surge moved across the island, it picked up not just water, but everything else. Houses, trees, carriages, livestock, and yes, people. All of this material was compressed into a constantly shifting mass of destruction that could crush, impale, or simply batter you to death in an instant. Survivors later described it as trying to swim through a liquid demolition site, where every piece of debris was a potential instrument of death. If you're still conscious by 6 p.m., you're now dealing with complete darkness. The storm has knocked out all electrical power, and the combination of thick clouds and flying debris has blocked out what little daylight remains. You're fighting for your life in complete blackness, with only the sound of destruction and the occasional flash of lightning to give you any sense of your surroundings. The disorientation is complete and absolute. The psychological impact of what you're experiencing would be just as deadly as the physical danger. Human beings aren't designed to process this level of chaos and destruction. Your mind, evolved for survival in much smaller scale emergencies, would simply overload. Many survivors reported a kind of dissociative state, where they felt like they were watching the disaster happen to someone else. Others described a complete loss of the ability to make rational decisions, standing paralyzed while buildings collapsed around them. By 7 p.m., if by some miracle you're still alive, you'd be dealing with hypothermia. Despite the warm Gulf water, hours of exposure to hurricane-force winds and constant immersion have lowered your core body temperature to dangerous levels. Your ability to think clearly is compromised, your muscle coordination is failing, and your body is beginning to shut down non-essential functions. You're entering the final stages of what would almost certainly be a fatal encounter with the most powerful natural force ever to strike the American mainland. The storm surge reaches its absolute peak around 8 p.m., with some estimates placing the wall of water at over 20 feet high in some areas. At this point, if you're experiencing this disaster, you're not dealing with a flood anymore. You're dealing with a temporary ocean that has formed where your city used to be. The water extends from the Gulf of Mexico to Galveston Bay, turning the entire island into a shallow sea filled with the remnants of human civilization. As night falls completely, you're facing the final, most terrifying phase of the hurricane, the backside of the storm. As the eye passes over the island, there's a brief period of calm that gives false hope to anyone still alive. But then the winds return from the opposite direction, often with even greater violence than before. Structures that survived the initial assault are now hit from their weak side, collapsing in ways that trap anyone seeking shelter inside. If you're still alive by 10 p.m., you're experiencing something that would be almost impossible to survive. The return surge. As the hurricane moves inland, all of that water that flooded the island has to go somewhere. It begins rushing back toward the Gulf, creating powerful currents in the opposite direction. You're now dealing with a massive undertow that can drag you out to sea, along with debris, animals, and the bodies of those who didn't survive the evening's events. If you're enjoying this peaceful journey through history's chaos, consider subscribing for more bedtime disasters. Now, let's get back to the Galveston hurricane and explore how this night of terror would ultimately reshape not just a city, but America's understanding of nature's power. The final hours of September 8th, 1900, would test every aspect of human endurance. Those few who managed to find secure shelter in the strongest buildings still faced hours of psychological torture as the hurricane's winds gradually weakened from catastrophic to merely life-threatening. The sound alone, described by survivors as similar to 1,000 freight trains running simultaneously, was enough to drive some people to complete mental breakdown. By midnight, as the storm finally began to weaken, you'd be facing a transformed world. If you somehow survived until dawn on September 9th, you'd wake up to discover that the Galveston you knew no longer existed. In its place was a wasteland of debris, bodies, and the remnants of what had been one of America's most prosperous cities. Over 6,000 people didn't see that sunrise, making this the deadliest natural disaster in American history. The truth is, if you had been in Galveston on September 8th, 1900, your chances of survival would have depended almost entirely on luck. No amount of preparation, strength, or intelligence could have guaranteed your safety against forces this overwhelming dun star. The hurricane didn't discriminate between rich and poor, prepared and unprepared, young and old. It was an equal opportunity destroyer that reminded humanity of our fundamental vulnerability to the natural world. The morning after, September 9th, 1900, would reveal the full scope of nature's violence in ways that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. If you had somehow made it through the night, you'd wake up to a landscape that looked like the surface of an alien planet, where familiar streets once ran. Massive piles of debris stretched as far as the eye could see. These weren't just random collections of storm wreckage. They were compressed walls of destruction, sometimes reaching heights of 20 feet or more. Imagine stepping outside your damaged shelter, if you still had one, and finding that your neighbor's house was now sitting in your backyard, completely intact but facing the wrong direction. Or discovering that the massive Castilian facade of a downtown building had been picked up and deposited 3 blocks away, standing upright as if someone had simply decided to relocate it overnight. The hurricane had played a cosmic game of pick-up sticks with an entire city, and the results defied all logic and human understanding. The debris fields weren't just made of buildings and trees. Mixed throughout these towering piles were the personal belongings of thousands of families. Children's toys, wedding photographs, kitchen utensils, books, clothing, all jumbled together with pieces of ships, railroad cars, and sections of the famous Galveston seawall that was supposed to protect the city. Walking through this landscape would have been like navigating through the contents of a giant's toy box, if that giant had a particularly dark sense of humor. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the post-storm environment would have been the smell. With thousands of bodies buried under debris, decomposing livestock scattered everywhere, and organic matter rotting in the warm Texas sun, the air would have carried an odor unlike anything you'd ever experienced. Survivors described it as sweet, metallic, and utterly nauseating. A constant reminder of the massive loss of life that had occurred in just a few hours. The silence would have been equally unsettling. After experiencing the deafening roar of hurricane winds for hours, the sudden quiet would have felt almost oppressive. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, no familiar sounds of human activity. Just the occasional creak of settling debris and the distant sound of survivors calling out for missing family members. It was as if the storm had not just destroyed buildings and killed people, but had sucked all the life out of the very air itself. If you were among the survivors tasked with the grim work of recovery, you'd quickly realize that normal methods of dealing with death and destruction were completely inadequate. There were simply too many bodies to bury individually, and the risk of disease from decomposition in the hot, humid climate was enormous. The city would ultimately resort to burning the dead in massive funeral pyres on the beach, a decision that traumatized even the most hardened survivors, but was necessary to prevent epidemic disease. The psychological aftermath would have been just as devastating as the physical destruction. Survivors reported years of nightmares, an inability to sleep during storms, and a constant anxiety about the weather that never fully disappeared. Children who lived through the hurricane often developed lifelong phobias of wind and rain. The sound of waves, once a pleasant reminder of seaside living, became a source of terror for many who had seen what the ocean could do when it decided to visit the land. But here you are, safe in your bed, listening to this story of survival and destruction from over a century ago. The gentle rain sounds in the background are a comforting reminder of water in its proper place, falling peacefully from the sky rather than surging violently across the land. As we prepare to continue our exploration of this remarkable disaster, take a moment to appreciate the simple luxury of being dry, safe, and sheltered from the storms of both past and present. The biography of Isaac Cline, the weatherman who missed history's deadliest hurricane. As the debris settles in our minds from that horrific night of September 8th, 1900, let's turn our attention to one of the most fascinating and tragic figures in this disaster, Dr. Isaac Monroe Cline, the man whose job it was to see this storm coming, but who became both hero and scapegoat in America's deadliest natural disaster. Picture Isaac Cline on the morning of September 8th, 1900, standing on the beach in Galveston, watching the surf with the trained eye of a meteorologist. At 39 years old, he's the section director for the U.S. Weather Bureau in Galveston, a position that makes him the most respected authority on weather in the entire region. He's a man of science, armed with barometers, anemometers, and thermometers, believing firmly that human knowledge and technology can predict and perhaps even tame nature's fury. On this particular morning, he has no idea he's about to become the central figure in one of meteorology's greatest failures. Cline wasn't just any weather observer. He was considered brilliant, a man who had worked his way up through the ranks of the Weather Bureau through sheer intellectual prowess and dedication. Born in Tennessee in 1861, he had joined the Signal Corps as a young man, back when weather forecasting was still a military operation. He'd served at stations across the country, learning to read the subtle signs that nature provided, the behavior of clouds, the direction of winds, the drop in barometric pressure that could signal approaching storms. By 1889, Cline had been assigned to Galveston, and he'd quickly established himself as more than just a government bureaucrat. He was a pillar of the community, a man whose weather predictions helped ships' captains decide when to sail, farmers determine when to plant, and families plan their weekend outings. His daily forecasts appeared in the local newspapers, and his meteorological reports were consulted by everyone from cotton merchants to society ladies planning garden parties. But Isaac Cline carried with him a dangerous combination of scientific confidence and institutional arrogance that would prove nearly fatal on September 8, 1900. Like many educated men of his era, he believed that human understanding of natural phenomena had reached a level of sophistication that could predict and prepare for almost anything nature might produce. The Weather Bureau, after all, was a marvel of modern organization, with telegraph lines connecting observers across the continent, allowing for the first truly national weather prediction system. More troubling, Cline had publicly stated his belief that Galveston was essentially hurricane-proof. In 1891, he had written an article dismissing fears that a major hurricane could devastate the island, arguing that the shallow waters of the Gulf would prevent storm surges from reaching dangerous heights. He theorized that any approaching hurricane would lose strength as it passed over the continental shelf, and that the city's location made it naturally protected from the worst effects of tropical storms. These weren't casual opinions. They were professional meteorological judgments that had been published and widely circulated, giving the residents of Galveston a false sense of security that would prove deadly. On the morning of September 6, 1900, Cline received the first reports of a tropical disturbance moving through the Caribbean. The storm had already caused significant damage in Cuba, but the central office of the Weather Bureau in Washington, D.C., predicted it would curve northeastward and make landfall somewhere along the Florida coast. Cline dutifully posted the appropriate warnings, but they were for a storm that was supposedly heading away from Texas, not toward it. But by September 7th, something wasn't adding up in Cline's careful observations. The barometric pressure in Galveston was dropping faster than his calculations suggested it should if the storm were indeed moving toward Florida. The winds were coming from the northeast, when they should have been from the southeast if the hurricane were following its predicted path. Most telling of all, the swells rolling in from the Gulf were larger and more frequent than anything he'd observed from a distant storm. This is where Isaac Cline faced the defining moment of his career. He could trust the official forecasts from Washington based on limited telegraph reports and theoretical models, or he could trust his own eyes and instruments. The institutional pressure to conform to the Central Bureau's predictions was enormous. Contradicting Washington's forecast could end his career, especially if he were wrong. But if he were right, and the storm were actually heading for Galveston, thousands of lives hung in the balance. On the morning of September 8th, Cline made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Despite his growing certainty that the hurricane was approaching Galveston directly, he issued only a standard storm warning, not the dire evacuation notice that might have saved thousands of lives. Part of this was institutional constraint. He simply didn't have the authority to contradict Washington's official forecast. But part of it was his own scientific hubris, his published belief that Galveston couldn't be seriously damaged by a hurricane. As the morning progressed and conditions continued to deteriorate, Cline began to realize the magnitude of his error. By noon, he was driving up and down the beach in a horse-drawn cart, personally warning people to move to higher ground. But his warnings came too late and were too limited in scope. Most residents had no idea that their trusted weather expert was now desperately trying to undo the damage caused by his earlier reassurances. The irony of Cline's situation becomes even more tragic when you consider his personal circumstances. He lived in a large wooden house near the beach with his pregnant wife Cora and their 3 young daughters. As the storm intensified throughout the day, he faced the same impossible choices as every other Galveston resident. Stay in a structure that might not survive the night, or venture out into conditions that were becoming increasingly deadly. Cline's house became an impromptu shelter for neighbors and strangers seeking refuge. By evening, over 50 people had crowded into his home, trusting that the weatherman's house would surely be the safest place to ride out the storm. The irony was crushing. The man whose job it was to predict the weather had inadvertently lured dozens of people into what might become a death trap. As the hurricane reached its peak intensity around 8 p.m., Cline's house began to disintegrate around them. The storm surge had reached levels he had declared impossible, and the wind speeds exceeded anything in his meteorological experience. In the chaos and darkness, he lost track of his pregnant wife. The house was breaking apart, people were being swept away by the surge, and the man who was supposed to understand weather better than anyone else was as helpless as a child in the face of nature's ultimate expression of power. When Cline's house finally collapsed completely, he was thrown into the surging waters, along with everyone else who had sought shelter there. In the darkness and confusion, he managed to grab onto floating debris along with his 3 daughters, but his wife Cora was lost to the storm. The weatherman, who had spent years studying the movements of air and water, was now at their mercy, clinging to wreckage and praying for survival. Miraculously, Cline and his daughters survived the night, though they were badly injured and traumatized. When dawn broke on September 9th, he emerged to find not just his own life in ruins, but an entire city destroyed and thousands dead. The storm he had failed to predict had become the deadliest natural disaster in American history, and he was the man who was supposed to have seen it coming. The aftermath of the hurricane marked the beginning of a different kind of storm for Isaac Cline, a bureaucratic and personal reckoning that would define the rest of his life. The Weather Bureau, eager to deflect criticism from the central office in Washington, gradually shifted blame toward the local forecasters, particularly Cline. His earlier public statements about Galveston's supposed immunity to hurricanes were dredged up and used as evidence of his incompetence. But the truth of Cline's story is far more complex than simple professional failure. In the days following the disaster, he worked tirelessly in the recovery effort, using his scientific training to help identify safe sources of drinking water and assess the structural integrity of damaged buildings. He helped coordinate the grim work of body recovery and participated in the massive public health effort required to prevent epidemic disease. More importantly, Cline began advocating for the construction of a seawall to protect Galveston from future storms, using his meteorological expertise to argue for specific design features that would maximize the barrier's effectiveness. His post-storm writings showed a man who had learned from catastrophic failure and was determined to use that knowledge to prevent future tragedies. Before we continue our journey through this disaster, I'd love to hear from you. What historical topic would you like us to explore next? Or just check in and let us know how you're doing. You're an important part of our little corner of the internet, and we appreciate you being here with us tonight. In 1902, Cline was quietly transferred from Galveston to New Orleans. Officially a promotion, but really a way for the Weather Bureau to remove him from the scene of his greatest failure. He continued his meteorological career for decades, eventually becoming one of the foremost experts on hurricane behavior and storm prediction. His later writings on tropical meteorology were considered authoritative, informed by the hard-won wisdom of a man who had experienced nature's power firsthand. But Isaac Cline never fully recovered from the events of September 8, 1900. Colleagues noted that he became more cautious in his predictions, more willing to err on the side of safety, even if it meant issuing warnings that proved unnecessary. He remarried and had more children, but friends observed that he never quite lost a haunted quality, particularly during hurricane season. He had looked into the face of absolute natural power and survived, but the experience had marked him permanently. The story of Isaac Cline embodies one of the most tragic aspects of the Galveston hurricane, the collision between human confidence and natural reality. Here was a man of science, armed with the best knowledge and technology of his era, who was utterly unprepared for what nature could actually produce. His failure wasn't just personal, it was institutional, representing the limitations of early meteorological science when faced with phenomena beyond its experience or understanding. Cline lived until 1955, dying at the age of 94 after a long career in meteorology. He witnessed the development of weather radar, satellite imagery, and computer modeling that would have prevented the kind of forecasting failure that occurred in 1900. But he also carried with him, for over half a century, the knowledge that his professional judgment had contributed to one of the greatest disasters in American history. In his final years, Cline wrote extensively about the hurricane, always emphasizing the lessons it taught about human vulnerability and the importance of respecting natural forces. He never tried to excuse his role in the disaster, but he used his experience to advocate for better hurricane preparedness and more conservative forecasting practices. His legacy became not just the failure of September 8, 1900, but the decades of work that followed, aimed at ensuring that such a catastrophic surprise could never happen again. What makes Isaac Cline's story even more compelling is how it reflects the broader transformation of American attitudes toward nature and scientific authority that occurred in the wake of the Galveston hurricane. Before 1900, the prevailing belief among educated Americans was that human ingenuity and scientific progress had essentially conquered the natural world. Cities like Galveston represented the triumph of civilization over wilderness, of human planning over natural chaos. The idea that a single storm could erase decades of progress and kill thousands of people in a matter of hours was almost incomprehensible to the Victorian mindset. Cline himself embodied this confidence. His meteorological training had taught him that weather followed predictable patterns that could be understood and forecast with reasonable accuracy. The Weather Bureau's network of telegraph communications allowed for unprecedented coordination of observations across vast distances. For the first time in human history, it seemed possible to see storms coming days in advance and prepare accordingly. This technological optimism wasn't just professional pride, it was a fundamental belief in human progress that defined the era. But the hurricane revealed the fragility of this confidence in ways that extended far beyond meteorology. The same telegraph lines that were supposed to provide early warning were among the first casualties of the storm, cutting Galveston off from the outside world precisely when communication was most crucial. The electric streetlights that symbolized the city's modernity were useless when the power failed. The sophisticated port facilities that made Galveston wealthy were transformed into fields of deadly debris. Everything that represented human mastery over nature became evidence of nature's ultimate supremacy. In the weeks following the disaster, Cline found himself caught between two conflicting narratives about what had happened. The official Weather Bureau position was that the storm had been an unprecedented, unforeseeable event, what we might today call a black swan occurrence, that couldn't have been predicted with the tools available in 1900. This narrative protected the institution and its methods, while acknowledging the tragedy of the outcome. But survivors and critics told a different story. They pointed to Cline's earlier writings, dismissing Galveston's hurricane vulnerability, to the inadequate warnings issued on September 8th, and to the Weather Bureau's apparent inability to track a storm that Cuban meteorologists had been monitoring for days. This counter-narrative suggested that the disaster wasn't an act of God or an unforeseeable natural event, but rather a failure of human institutions and scientific hubris. The truth, as Cline came to understand during his long years of reflection, lay somewhere between these extremes. The 1900 hurricane was indeed unprecedented in American meteorological experience, but it wasn't unforeseeable. The warning signs were there for anyone trained to read them, but the institutional structure of weather forecasting in 1900 wasn't designed to process information that contradicted established predictions or challenged bureaucratic hierarchies. Cline's personal transformation in the years following the hurricane reflected broader changes in American scientific culture. The disaster marked the beginning of a more humble, empirical approach to natural phenomena, one that acknowledged the limits of human knowledge and the need for constant vigilance against natural forces. This shift wasn't just philosophical, it had practical implications for everything from building codes to emergency preparedness to the development of new meteorological technologies. The psychological burden that Cline carried was made heavier by his intimate knowledge of what might have been prevented. In his private writings, discovered years after his death, he calculated that even a 6-hour advance warning might have saved thousands of lives. People could have moved to the strongest buildings, evacuated the most vulnerable areas, or, at minimum, avoided the fatal mistake of seeking shelter in structures that weren't built to withstand hurricane-force winds and 20-foot storm surges. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of Cline's later reflections was his recognition that the disaster had been as much a failure of imagination as a failure of science. The meteorological tools of 1900 were primitive, but they weren't completely useless. The problem was that no one, including Cline himself, could conceive of a storm powerful enough to do what the Galveston hurricane actually did. The failure wasn't just in reading the data, it was in understanding what the data might mean when pushed to its absolute extremes. This failure of imagination extended beyond individual meteorologists to encompass the entire culture of Galveston and similar coastal communities. The city's leaders had invested millions of dollars in port facilities, residential development, and commercial infrastructure based on the assumption that major hurricanes were either impossible or manageable. The psychological and financial commitment to this assumption made it nearly impossible to acknowledge warnings that contradicted it, even when those warnings came from trained professionals. Cline spent his later years trying to bridge this gap between scientific knowledge and public understanding. He became an advocate for what we would now call risk communication, arguing that meteorologists had an obligation not just to make accurate predictions, but to help communities understand and prepare for low-probability, high-impact events. His writings from the 1920s and 1930s anticipated many of the concepts that would later become central to modern disaster preparedness and emergency management. The gentle rain sounds that accompany tonight's story serve as a reminder of water in its peaceful state. Far removed from the violence that Isaac Cline witnessed on that terrible night in 1900, as we prepare to continue our deep exploration of this remarkable disaster, consider the weight of responsibility that rested on one man's shoulders, and how a single storm changed not just a city, but the entire science of weather prediction in America. The archaeological mystery of hurricane formation and the science behind nature's ultimate destroyer. As we drift deeper into our exploration of September 8th, 1900, let's turn our attention to one of the most fascinating mysteries surrounding the Galveston hurricane. Where did this monster actually come from, and what made it so uniquely devastating? The story we're about to explore reads like a detective tale, where meteorologists have spent over a century piecing together clues to understand how nature assembled the perfect weapon of mass destruction. The mystery begins thousands of miles away from Galveston, in the sun-baked waters off the coast of West Africa. Picture the Sahara Desert in late August 1900, where temperatures soar above 120 degrees Fahrenheit and the sand radiates heat like a massive furnace. As this superheated air rises, it creates atmospheric disturbances that begin to move westward across the Atlantic Ocean. These disturbances, which modern meteorologists call tropical waves, are the seeds from which hurricanes grow. But in 1900, no one had any idea that events in Africa could determine the fate of a Texas city. What happened next was a process so complex and dependent on precise conditions that it seems almost miraculous that hurricanes form at all. As the atmospheric disturbance moved across the Atlantic, it encountered water temperatures that were just right. Not too cool to starve the developing storm of energy, but not so warm as to create the kind of wind shear that tears developing storms apart. The ocean surface temperature needed to be at least 80 degrees Fahrenheit to a depth of about 150 feet, providing the massive amounts of water vapor that would fuel the storm's growth. But temperature alone wasn't enough. The developing storm also required something called low wind shear, meaning that the winds at different altitudes had to be moving at roughly the same speed and in the same direction. High wind shear acts like a giant scissors, cutting the top off developing storms and preventing them from organizing into the rotating systems we recognize as hurricanes. In late August 1900, the atmospheric conditions over the Atlantic were perfectly aligned to allow a storm system to grow and intensify without interference. As the disturbance moved westward, it began to feed on the warm, moist air rising from the ocean's surface. This process, called convection, is the engine that powers all hurricanes. Warm, moist air rises, cools, and condenses into clouds, releasing enormous amounts of energy in the process. This energy heats the surrounding air, causing it to rise even faster, which draws in more warm, moist air from the ocean surface. It's a feedback loop that, under the right conditions, can become incredibly powerful. The mystery deepens when we consider the Coriolis effect, the force created by the Earth's rotation that causes moving objects to curve to the right in the northern hemisphere. This invisible force is what gives hurricanes their characteristic spinning motion, but it's so weak near the equator that storms can't form there. The developing hurricane had to be at least 5 degrees north of the equator for the Coriolis effect to be strong enough to create the rotation that defines these storms. By early September 1900, satellite imagery would have revealed a beautiful but ominous spiral of clouds slowly rotating counterclockwise as it moved across the Atlantic. But of course, there were no satellites in 1900, no weather radar, no aircraft to fly into the storm and measure its strength. The hurricane was essentially invisible to human observation until it was close enough to land for ships to encounter it and telegraph their observations to shore. What made this particular storm so dangerous wasn't just its size or intensity, but its path. Most Atlantic hurricanes follow a curved trajectory that takes them up the eastern seaboard of the United States, where they encounter cooler water and stronger wind shear that weakens them before they make landfall. But the 1900 storm took an unusual route, moving almost directly westward across the Gulf of Mexico, where the water was exceptionally warm and the wind shear was minimal. The Gulf of Mexico in September 1900 was like a giant bathtub filled with hurricane fuel. The shallow waters had been heated by months of intense summer sun, creating surface temperatures in the mid to high 80s Fahrenheit. Even more importantly, this warm water extended deep below the surface, meaning that the hurricane's own winds couldn't churn up cooler water from below to weaken the storm. Instead, every mile the hurricane traveled across the Gulf made it stronger. Here's where the mystery becomes almost supernatural in its precision. For a hurricane to maintain its strength while crossing a body of water, it needs to encounter virtually no obstacles. A encounter with a cold front, a patch of dry air, or even a slight change in upper-level wind patterns can cause rapid weakening. But the atmospheric conditions over the Gulf of Mexico in early September 1900 were remarkably stable and conducive to hurricane maintenance and even intensification. Modern computer models, working backward from historical data, suggest that the hurricane may have reached category 4 status, with sustained winds of at least 140 miles per hour as it approached the Texas coast. Some evidence suggests it may have briefly reached category 5 intensity, making it one of the most powerful storms ever to make landfall in the United States. But these classifications didn't exist in 1900, and the instruments capable of measuring such extreme wind speeds were destroyed early in the storm. The storm surge produced by the hurricane represents perhaps the most mysterious and devastating aspect of the entire disaster. Storm surge is created when hurricane-force winds push ocean water toward shore faster than it can drain away. The size of the surge depends on the storm's intensity, the shape of the coastline, the depth of the ocean near shore, and the angle at which the storm approaches land. In Galveston's case, every one of these factors combined to create the worst possible scenario. Galveston Bay, the body of water behind the island, acted like a funnel that concentrated the storm surge and prevented it from spreading out over a wider area. The relatively shallow waters of the Gulf near Galveston meant that more of the hurricane's energy went into pushing water forward rather than downward into deep ocean. Most critically, the hurricane approached from the southeast, the exact direction that would drive the maximum amount of water over the island. But here's the truly mysterious part. The storm surge at Galveston wasn't just water. As it moved across the Gulf, it picked up sediment, debris, and marine life, creating a kind of liquid concrete that was far more destructive than pure seawater would have been. Survivors described the surge as black and thick, carrying with it pieces of ships, sections of offshore oil platforms, and massive amounts of sand and mud that added weight and abrasive power to the already devastating wall of water. The archaeological evidence of the storm surge is still being uncovered today. Researchers have found layers of marine sediment miles inland from the coast, deposited by the hurricane's surge and preserved in the geological record like a fingerprint of the disaster. These sediment layers contain shells, fish bones, and other marine debris that shouldn't exist so far from the ocean, creating a permanent record of how far inland the surge penetrated. Recent archaeological excavations in Galveston have revealed foundation stones from buildings that were completely swept away by the storm, now buried under layers of hurricane-deposited sediment. These discoveries help scientists understand not just how powerful the storm surge was, but how it moved across the island, carrying away some structures while leaving others mysteriously untouched. One of the most intriguing mysteries surrounding the 1900 hurricane involves its aftermath and the way it seemed to vanish as quickly and mysteriously as it had appeared. After devastating Galveston, the storm moved inland and rapidly weakened, as hurricanes typically do when they lose their source of warm ocean water. But tracking its exact path and ultimate dissipation has proven surprisingly difficult for modern meteorologists working with historical data. What we do know is that the hurricane brought significant rainfall and flooding to much of Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas as it moved inland. Some areas received over a foot of rain in just a few hours, causing widespread flooding that extended the disaster's impact far beyond the immediate coastal region. The storm's remnants may have contributed to weather patterns that affected the entire central United States for weeks after the initial disaster. The mystery of the 1900 hurricane's formation and behavior has become a kind of holy grail for hurricane researchers. Understanding exactly how this storm developed and intensified could provide crucial insights into how climate change might affect hurricane formation in the future. Some researchers believe that the unusually warm ocean temperatures that fueled the 1900 storm were part of a natural climate cycle, while others suggest they may have been an early indicator of human-induced climate change. Modern hurricane hunters, the brave pilots who fly aircraft directly into the eyes of storms to gather data, often reference the 1900 Galveston hurricane as the benchmark against which all other storms are measured. They carry sophisticated instruments that can measure wind speeds, pressure, temperature, and humidity with incredible precision, gathering in real time the kind of data that would have been impossible to collect in 1900. But even with all of our modern technology, the fundamental mystery of hurricane formation remains humbling. We can track these storms with satellite imagery, probe them with aircraft, and model their behavior with supercomputers. But we still can't predict exactly when and where they'll form, how strong they'll become, or precisely where they'll make landfall. The 1900 Galveston hurricane serves as a reminder that nature still holds secrets that human science hasn't fully unlocked. The archaeological study of historical hurricanes has become an entire field of research, with scientists examining everything from tree rings to coral growth patterns to understand how storm activity has changed over centuries. These natural archives contain records of storms that occurred long before humans were keeping detailed weather observations, providing a window into the deep history of hurricane activity in the Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico. What emerges from this research is a picture of hurricane activity that's far more variable and unpredictable than early meteorologists realized. Some decades see numerous intense hurricanes, while others are relatively quiet. The 1900 storm occurred during what researchers now recognize as a particularly active period for major hurricanes, But even within that context, it stands out as an exceptional event. The cultural mystery of how such a devastating storm could strike without adequate warning reflects not just the limitations of 1900s technology, but also the human tendency to underestimate low-probability, high-impact events. The same psychological factors that led Galveston's residents to dismiss hurricane warnings continue to influence how modern communities prepare for natural disasters. The most fascinating archaeological discovery related to the 1900 hurricane came in 1998, nearly a century after the disaster, when construction workers building a new hotel in downtown Galveston uncovered what appeared to be a mass grave. But this wasn't just any burial site. It was a carefully arranged collection of human remains that told the story of the hurricane's immediate aftermath in ways that no written record could capture. The skeletal remains showed evidence of the unique injuries caused by hurricane-force debris, fractures that could only have been caused by flying pieces of buildings, boats, and other heavy objects moving at incredible speeds. Some skulls bore the distinctive marks of impact with wooden beams, while other bones showed the crushing injuries consistent with being trapped under collapsed structures. The archaeological team that studied these remains was able to reconstruct not just how these people died, but the specific sequence of events that led to their deaths during those terrible hours on September 8th. More intriguingly, the arrangement of the bodies suggested that this was one of the mass burial sites created in the days immediately following the storm, when the sheer number of casualties overwhelmed normal burial practices. The bodies had been placed with a care and dignity that spoke to the humanity of the survivors, even in the face of unimaginable devastation. Personal effects found with the remains, buttons, pieces of jewelry, fragments of clothing, provided haunting glimpses into the lives of people whose names were lost to history, but whose final moments were preserved in the archaeological record. Chemical analysis of the bones revealed another layer of the hurricane's mystery. The remains showed unusually high levels of salt, not just on the surface where you might expect from exposure to seawater, but actually incorporated into the bone structure itself. This suggested that these individuals had been exposed to salt water for extended periods while still alive, consistent with survivors' accounts of people trapped in debris-filled floodwaters for hours before finally succumbing to their injuries or drowning. The soil layers surrounding the burial site told their own story of the disaster's immediate aftermath. Researchers found distinct strata of hurricane-deposited sediment mixed with ash from the funeral pyres that burned for weeks after the storm, creating a geological timeline of the recovery effort. Mixed throughout these layers were fragments of everyday objects from 1900 Galveston, pieces of china, metal buttons, glass bottles, all of it jumbled together in a chaotic mixture that reflected the complete disruption of normal life. Perhaps most mysteriously, the archaeological team discovered evidence of what they termed hurricane glass. Small, smooth fragments of glass that had been tumbled and polished by the storm's winds and water to the point where they resembled natural sea glass. But unlike normal sea glass, which forms over decades of wave action, these pieces showed the distinctive patterns of rapid formation under extreme conditions. The discovery suggested that the hurricane's winds were so powerful they could literally reshape solid materials in a matter of hours. The study of historic hurricane deposits has become a crucial tool for understanding long-term climate patterns and storm behavior. By examining sediment cores taken from coastal marshes and lakes, researchers can identify the signatures of major hurricanes going back thousands of years. These natural archives reveal that storms like the 1900 hurricane, while rare, are part of recurring patterns of intense hurricane activity that occur roughly every 200 to 300 years. What's particularly intriguing about these long-term records is that they suggest the 1900 storm may not have been as unprecedented as it seemed at the time. Evidence from sediment cores indicates that similar mega-hurricanes struck the Texas coast in approximately 1600 and 1400 AD, suggesting that Galveston was built in the path of storms that recur on geological timescales far longer than human memory or historical records. This discovery has profound implications for modern coastal development and hurricane preparedness. If storms of similar magnitude to the 1900 hurricane occur every few centuries, then much of the current development along the Gulf Coast has been built during a relatively quiet period that may not represent the long-term norm. The archaeological evidence suggests that what we consider extreme events may actually be part of natural cycles that extend far beyond the scope of written history. As we've seen throughout history, nature has a way of humbling human confidence and revealing the limits of our understanding. The gentle rain sounds that accompany our story tonight serve as a peaceful reminder of water's gentler moods, far removed from the mysterious and terrifying forces that converged to create the perfect storm of September 8, 1900. In our final segment, we'll explore how Galveston's elite experienced this disaster, and how their response shaped the city's remarkable recovery and transformation. How Galveston's elite survived the storm and rebuilt a city. As we enter the final chapter of our journey through America's deadliest natural disaster, let's explore a side of the 1900 Galveston hurricane that reveals as much about human nature as it does about natural forces, how the city's wealthy elite experienced the storm, and how their response to the catastrophe would fundamentally reshape not just Galveston, but America's entire approach to disaster recovery and urban planning. Picture the grand mansions along Broadway, Galveston's most prestigious avenue, on the evening of September 8, 1900. These weren't modest middle-class homes. They were palatial residences built by cotton barons, shipping magnates, and railroad tycoons who had made Galveston one of the wealthiest cities in America. The Gresham Castle, the Bishop's Palace, the Moody Mansion, these architectural marvels represented not just personal wealth, but the confidence of an entire social class that believed money and status could insulate them from life's uncertainties. The reality of that night would prove both the power and the limits of privilege in the face of absolute natural forces. While the poor residents of the East End were crowded into flimsy wooden structures that offered little protection from wind and water, Galveston's elite had built their homes like fortresses. Thick masonry walls, deep foundations, and elevated positions gave these mansions significant advantages over the humble dwellings that housed most of the city's population. Consider the experience of Henry Rosenberg, one of Galveston's most prominent bankers and philanthropists, whose mansion stood like a castle on Broadway. As the hurricane intensified throughout September 8th, Rosenberg's home became an impromptu shelter for dozens of neighbors and strangers seeking refuge. The thick walls and solid construction that had been built to display wealth now served a far more practical purpose, keeping people alive. But even the strongest mansions couldn't completely shield their occupants from the storm's fury. Survivors from these grand homes described hours of terror, as hurricane-force winds howled through the corridors and storm. Surge seeped through doors and windows that had never been designed to keep out the Gulf of Mexico. The crystal chandeliers that had illuminated countless elegant dinner parties swayed violently in the darkness, threatening to become deadly projectiles. Persian rugs worth thousands of dollars were soaked with salt water and debris, transforming symbols of luxury into soggy reminders of nature's indifference to human achievement. What's particularly fascinating about the elite's experience during the hurricane is how it stripped away the social conventions that normally governed their interactions. In the elegant drawing rooms of Broadway mansions, wealthy matrons found themselves sharing space with servants, laborers, and complete strangers, all of them reduced to the same basic struggle for survival. The storm had created a temporary democracy of desperation that crossed all social boundaries. Mrs. Emily Austin Bryan Perry, descendant of Stephen F. Austin and one of Galveston's most prominent society ladies, later wrote about spending the night crouched in her mansion's strongest interior room alongside her cook, gardener, and several refugee families who had sought shelter there. She described the surreal experience of making conversation about the weather with people she would normally have encountered only as part of the city's invisible workforce, while outside the storm tried to tear her house apart. The morning of September 9th revealed both the advantages and limitations of wealth in the face of natural disaster. Many of the grand mansions had survived the night structurally intact, though damaged and flooded. Their occupants emerged to find that their solid construction and elevated positions had indeed provided better protection than the flimsy structures that housed the poor. But they also emerged into a world where traditional markers of status and power had been temporarily rendered meaningless. The Galveston Wharf Company, controlled by a handful of wealthy families, had been completely destroyed. The cotton warehouses that had generated enormous fortunes were now twisted wreckage scattered across the island. The railroad terminals, shipping facilities, and commercial buildings that had made Galveston the Wall Street of the South were either destroyed or severely damaged. In a matter of hours, the economic foundations of the elite's power had been swept away as thoroughly as the homes of the poor. But here's where the story becomes truly remarkable. Instead of fleeing to their properties in Houston or New York, many of Galveston's wealthiest residents chose to stay and lead the recovery effort. Within days of the disaster, they had organized what would become one of the most efficient and comprehensive disaster response efforts in American history up to that time. The Galveston Relief Committee, formed just 3 days after the hurricane, was dominated by the city's business elite. These were men who had built fortunes by organizing complex commercial enterprises, and they approached disaster recovery with the same systematic efficiency they had applied to cotton trading and railroad construction. They established committees for debris removal, body disposal, food distribution, medical care, and reconstruction planning, creating an organizational structure that would serve as a model for future disaster responses. Isaac H. Kempner, heir to a banking and mercantile fortune, became one of the key organizers of the relief effort. His experience managing complex business operations proved invaluable in coordinating the massive logistical challenges of clearing debris, preventing disease, and restoring basic services to a devastated city. But Kempner's journals, discovered decades later, revealed the psychological toll of leading recovery efforts while dealing with personal losses and trauma. The elite's approach to reconstruction revealed both their strengths and their blind spots. On one hand, they had the financial resources, organizational skills, and political connections necessary to secure federal aid and private donations from across the country. They could write large personal checks to fund immediate relief efforts, and their business networks provided access to construction materials, transportation, and expertise that would have been impossible for a community of modest means to obtain. On the other hand, their vision of reconstruction often prioritized the restoration of economic systems and infrastructure that had served their interests, sometimes at the expense of the broader community's needs. The decision to rebuild the port facilities and commercial district before addressing housing for displaced working-class families reflected priorities that, while economically rational, also reinforced existing social hierarchies. The most ambitious project undertaken by Galveston's elite was the construction of the famous seawall, a massive concrete barrier designed to protect the city from future storm surges. This engineering marvel, begun in 1902 and eventually extending over 10 miles along the Gulf shore, represented both the advantages and limitations of wealth-directed recovery efforts. The seawall was undoubtedly a remarkable achievement. At its completion, it was the longest continuous sidewalk in the world, and one of the most impressive coastal engineering projects ever undertaken in the United States. The elite families who funded and organized its construction demonstrated a level of long-term thinking and community commitment that was genuinely admirable. They were investing their own money in a project that would protect not just their properties, but the entire community. But the seawall also reflected the elite's tendency to seek technological solutions to natural problems, sometimes without fully considering the broader implications of their choices. The massive concrete barrier would indeed protect Galveston from future storm surges, but it would also fundamentally alter the island's natural systems and contribute to beach erosion that continues to this day. Perhaps more controversially, the elite's reconstruction plans involved what they called grade raising, the process of elevating the entire city to reduce flood risk. This massive engineering project, which involved pumping sand and silt under existing buildings to raise them as much as 17 feet, was funded and organized by the wealthy families who controlled the city's economy and politics. The grade-raising project was genuinely impressive from an engineering standpoint, and it did succeed in reducing flood risk for the entire community. But it also had the effect of reinforcing existing social geography, as the areas that received the most elevation were generally those where the elite lived and conducted business. The East End, where most of the working class and immigrant families lived, received less attention and investment in the elevation project. The psychological impact of the hurricane on Galveston's elite is perhaps the most complex aspect of their story. Many of these families had built their identities around the belief that success and status provided security and control over their environment. The hurricane had demonstrated the limits of that control in ways that were deeply unsettling to people who were accustomed to shaping events rather than being shaped by them. Some members of the elite never fully recovered from this psychological blow. They became obsessively focused on disaster preparedness, building increasingly elaborate hurricane shelters and developing detailed evacuation plans that sometimes bordered on the paranoid. Others seemed to develop a kind of survivor's guilt, becoming unusually generous in their philanthropic activities and more sensitive to the needs of the broader community. But many channeled their post-hurricane anxiety into remarkably productive activities. The disaster had revealed both their vulnerability and their capacity for leadership under extreme circumstances. They had discovered that their wealth and organizational skills, while unable to prevent natural disasters, could be powerfully effective in responding to them. The political transformation that followed the hurricane was largely driven by the elites. Recognition that traditional forms of municipal government were inadequate for managing complex recovery efforts, they pushed for the adoption of the Galveston Plan, a form of commission government that concentrated executive power in the hands of a few appointed experts rather than elected politicians. This political innovation, which was copied by cities across the United States, reflected the elite's faith in expertise and efficiency over democratic participation. While the commission system did prove effective in managing Galveston's recovery and subsequent development, it also had the effect of concentrating political power in the hands of the same economic elites who had always controlled the city. The cultural legacy of the elite's response to the 1900 hurricane extends far beyond Galveston itself. Their systematic approach to disaster recovery, their emphasis on long-term planning and infrastructure investment, and their willingness to adopt new technologies and organizational methods became models for disaster response that influenced American emergency management for decades to come. But perhaps the most lasting impact of their response was the demonstration that private wealth and initiative could, under certain circumstances, accomplish things that government agencies and traditional charitable organizations could not. This lesson would be repeatedly invoked during subsequent disasters, sometimes leading to remarkably effective private relief efforts, but also sometimes serving as justification for limiting government involvement in disaster preparedness and recovery. The mansions along Broadway that survived the 1900 hurricane became symbols of both resilience and privilege. Many of them were carefully restored and continued to serve as reminders of Galveston's Gilded Age prosperity. But they also serve as monuments to a particular approach to disaster recovery that emphasized technological solutions, elite leadership, and the power of concentrated wealth to reshape communities according to the vision of those who controlled the resources. As we reach the end of our journey through this remarkable disaster, it's worth reflecting on the complex legacy of the elite's response to the Galveston hurricane. Their leadership was genuinely crucial to the city's survival and recovery, and their innovations in disaster planning and coastal engineering had lasting positive impacts. But their response also reinforced existing power structures and social inequalities, ensuring that the benefits of recovery were distributed according to the same patterns that had characterized the city before the storm. The transformation of Galveston's elite from victims to leaders in the aftermath of the hurricane reveals one of the most fascinating aspects of human psychology during extreme crises. Within hours of emerging from their damaged mansions, these individuals who had spent their lives in comfort and luxury were making life and death decisions about resource allocation, public health measures, and community organization. The speed of this transformation suggests that the hurricane had awakened leadership capabilities that may have remained dormant during normal times. Consider the remarkable case of Magnolia Willis Seeley, wife of one of Galveston's wealthiest merchants, who transformed her damaged mansion into an impromptu hospital and refugee center in the days following the storm. Seeley, who had previously been known primarily for her elaborate social, entertaining, and charitable tea parties, suddenly found herself organizing medical care for hundreds of injured survivors, coordinating food distribution, and making crucial decisions about sanitation and disease prevention. Her personal diary, discovered in the 1970s during renovation of the Seeley mansion, provides an intimate window into this transformation. In entries written just days after the hurricane, she describes the surreal experience of using her finest china to serve soup to homeless families, and converting her ballroom into a makeshift morgue where bodies were prepared for the mass cremations that followed the disaster. The woman who had once worried about the proper etiquette for dinner party seating was now making decisions about which critically injured survivors could be saved and which were beyond help. The psychological adaptability demonstrated by Galveston's elite during this crisis challenges many assumptions about the relationship between wealth and resilience. While their material advantages certainly helped them survive the physical dangers of the hurricane, their rapid transition to effective crisis leadership suggests that their business and social experiences had provided them with transferable skills that proved crucial during the emergency. Many of these individuals had built their fortunes by managing complex enterprises that required quick decision-making, resource coordination, and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. The hurricane simply presented these skills with their ultimate test, forcing people who had managed cotton warehouses and shipping operations to apply the same organizational abilities to the coordination of disaster relief and community recovery. The elite's response also revealed the extent to which their pre-hurricane social networks could be rapidly repurposed for emergency coordination. The same informal communication systems that had once organized charity balls and business deals now facilitated the distribution of relief supplies and the coordination of reconstruction efforts. Social connections that had been maintained through dinner parties and club memberships became the foundation for remarkably efficient disaster response networks. But perhaps most intriguingly, the hurricanes seemed to awaken in many wealthy Galvestonians a sense of moral obligation that extended far beyond their immediate families and social circles. Men who had previously focused primarily on accumulating personal wealth suddenly found themselves thinking in terms of community survival and long-term collective welfare. This shift wasn't universal, and it wasn't always permanent, but it was widespread enough to fundamentally alter the city's approach to civic leadership and public responsibility. The reconstruction of Galveston's exclusive social institutions provides another fascinating window into how the elite processed and responded to their shared trauma. The Galveston Country Club, which had been completely destroyed by the hurricane, was rebuilt not just as a recreation facility, but as a kind of monument to survival and resilience. The new building incorporated numerous storm-resistant features and was designed to serve as an emergency shelter during future hurricanes. Similarly, the reconstruction of the city's most prestigious churches revealed how the disaster had affected the religious and philosophical outlook of the wealthy families who funded these institutions. Many of the new church buildings incorporated architectural elements that seemed to acknowledge the power of natural forces in ways that pre-hurricane religious architecture had not. Stained glass windows depicted biblical storms and floods with a vividness that suggested personal familiarity with such events, and sermon topics in the years following the hurricane frequently addressed themes of human vulnerability and divine power. The long-term economic impact of the elite's reconstruction choices would extend far beyond Galveston itself. The innovative engineering techniques developed for the seawall and grade-raising projects attracted national attention and influenced coastal development practices across the United States. The organizational methods pioneered during Galveston's recovery became models for disaster response that were studied and copied by communities facing similar challenges. But perhaps most significantly, the Galveston elite's response to the 1900 hurricane helped establish a template for private sector leadership during public emergencies that would become increasingly important in American society. Their demonstration that concentrated wealth could be rapidly mobilized for community benefit created expectations and precedents that continue to influence how we think about the role of private philanthropy and business leadership during crises. The gentle rain that has accompanied our exploration tonight serves as a peaceful reminder of water's capacity for both destruction and renewal. The 1900 Galveston hurricane revealed both the limits of human control over natural forces and the remarkable capacity of communities to adapt, survive, and even thrive in the aftermath of catastrophic events. If this helped you relax and learn something new, gently tap that subscribe button for more sleepy disasters every week. Sweet dreams, and remember, you're safe in your bed, unlike the people we just learned about. Sleep well,